And everywhere I go, in survivor advocacy spaces and academic spaces, and just kind of common spaces around Latino churches in Miami, this is the definition I hear. And I want to say this. I think that spiritual abuse for sure involves emotional and psychological abuse. Second, I think that the authors have good reasons to define it only as these two things. But third, despite that, this definition cannot be used to talk about Latino experiences of spiritual abuse, specifically related to colonialism and history. And fourth, I would argue that historically, this definition is actually regressive. And I'll point this out later, it's a worse definition of spiritual abuse than Catholics had in the Council of Trent. And this is a definition from 2018. And so, in light of that, I'd like to argue that this definition is insufficient because it's designed to only benefit people in the United Kingdom at the expense of literally everyone else in the world. And so you might ask, well, what may be the author's motivation for defining this type of abuse as emotional or psychological abuse? Well, they state this in their article. The people they're interviewing are in the UK, and they want to connect those survivors in the UK to legal resources and healthcare resources to help them. In the UK, you have the NHS, which already has robust laws for emotional and psychological abuse. And in the UK, unlike in the US, if someone emotionally abuses you, you can actually sue them, and there's really robust laws to protect them. That's the case in some places in the US, but not all. And again, that's so great for survivors there, but unfortunately, when I check in Miami and when I talk to my friends in the rest of Latino America, it's not, those laws, we don't have those laws. And saying this is the definition of spiritual abuse to the exclusion of survivors all around the world, including myself, is massively problematic. And it really can boil down to this question. If spiritual abuse is only emotional or psychological, then does that exclude the physical, social, economic, I'd even say like ontological violence that colonizing powers essentially levied on indigenous people, on enslaved people groups in the name of God? I mean, like, if it's only emotional or psychological, I guess if you're enslaved in the name of God, only the emotional parts of it is spiritual abuse, not like other parts of it. It doesn't work, right? And this is a problem because if you understand colonialism, it was very religious, a lot of it. Certainly, these historic powers have relied on a God that presented God as complicit in abuse, and I think any of us would be in a really bad spot if we try to argue that someone is not abusing spiritual power if they colonize you in the name of God, enslave you, murder you in the name of God, commit other atrocities in the name of God, and then force you to raise your children in that religious system. And so my point is that there's material realities that are perfected by abusing spiritual power, which is what the colonizers of the Caribbean did. But if we use the definition that's popular today, well, we cut them out of history, and we cut them out of their own experiences, and we're essentially gaslighting them, to use that word. And so what I propose in this paper is an amendment to their definition to include more people, and Latinos and other sorts of people. And my definition is very simple. It's any spiritual abuse is any form of abuse where the deity or the sacred is presented as complicit in abuse or used to justify that abuse. Now, what that does is that broadens it. Now it's not just emotional or psychological, it's a bigger umbrella that can cover more people. And I do want to spend the rest of my time giving examples of this from the early Caribbean. Specifically, I'm going to be covering from the early 1500s to about the 1600s. And I'm going to be using people who would be considered abusers and people who would be considered survivors. And I'll start with the abusers because I actually think that's a very important one. And so we're going to briefly talk about a center of colonial spiritual power in the early Caribbean, which is the Roman Catholic Church. And we're starting here because it's from here that many lives and peoples were affected. And it's also important to understand that indigenous people like Tainos, which I will discuss later, they didn't understand their oppressors just as Spaniards. They understood them as Christians. So if you were in the Spanish Caribbean, this is the center of defining whatever is sacred or God that's used to justify or oppress you. And so the first question is, well, how did the Roman Catholic Church understand spiritual abuse as just emotional or psychological abuse? And the answer is no, not even in the 15 and 1600s. And if we look at the Council of Trent, which took place between 1545 and 1563, that had cascading effects into the Caribbean, they're taking up issues like authority, the priesthood, indulgences. They're responding to critiques from other movements in Europe at the time. And it's at this time that the Catholic Church does something very odd. They publish their catechism, and they state that the document has to be translated into local and regional language so that everyone can be educated and so that everyone can know the rules, specifically so that people can understand the requirements of those people who had spiritual power. Now, in Article 10 of that catechism, it says that the forgiveness of sins was a power that must be protected and guarded by the clergy, as they are the only ones with the ability to exercise that power. And this is nothing new if you know anything about Catholicism. But when we tie this with the emphasis later about all the rules governing access to those positions of power, particularly the requirements for candidacy, and how those requirements in the Council of Trent are tailored to include protections against those who might exploit or those who might abuse their congregants physically, emotionally, religiously, all sorts of ways, we see that the idea here, at least in part of the Council of Trent, is to have the institution protect against abuses of religious power, specifically people trying to exploit people financially, which is, we can agree that finances are not emotions, right? And it's obvious, right? Like wage theft, exploitation, enslavement are not just emotional or psychological, they affect material realities. And so my point here is that even the group that perpetuated abuse can't just stuff these experiences into the bag of emotional or psychological abuse. And the 1500s Catholic Church, at least on paper, understood this, where the modern researchers defining spiritual abuse and cutting out people with their definition don't. And when we continue going on, if that's the abuser's perspective of it, another section of data that I lean on more heavily is actually an account I draw on from Bartolome de las Casas, titled A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies. And it demonstrates that the definition of spiritual abuse is only emotional or psychologically is insufficient because it would make this thing that is so clearly shown to be spiritual abuse not spiritual abuse. And what Bartolome does in this paper is he is attempting to, as a priest, move Philip II of Spain to end the mistreatment of indigenous people. And all of his appeals are about religion, the role of religion in government. And what Las Casas demonstrates here, at least in writing, is a consciousness that there were multiple forms of abuse that God was being presented as complicit in, and and God was made to justify in this region. And I want to be clear, these accounts that Las Casas is talking about are not emotional, they're not psychological, they're enslavement, murder, sexual abuse, other forms of abuse, economic exploitation. And according to Las Casas' account, for example, I'll give two from his account. The indigenous people of the Yucatan experienced 7 years of violence. And he says that this violence is committed in the name of God by a band of 30 Spaniards. But remember, the abusive Spaniards are identified as Christians serving Prince Philip. And the indigenous people would have known this by their religious title. And after 7 years of extreme violence, the party stopped their abuses for a time. And during that time, Las Casas tells us that 4 friars endeavored to share the message of their God to the indigenous people that survived these abuses. And over time, these 4 friars gained the trust of the surviving indigenous peoples, and the indigenous peoples of the Yucatan allowed them in as long as they promised that these 30 Spaniards who abused them for years would never return. So the friars agree, they get a letter from the Viceroy of Spain guaranteeing this, and they enter. And what Las Casas says is these friars were so effective, they were so humanizing, and yeah, this is Las Casas, so I might be biased, but maybe it's true. Within 40 days, he says, because of their ministry, these people offered their carved idols to be burned. And then the indigenous people start to entrust the friars with the education of their children. And then the indigenous people then build schools and invite their neighbors to come and learn from the poor friars. So for a time, things are going well. But then Las Casas states that these same 30 Christian abusers return, and they bring idols from other villages and force the indigenous survivors to make a deal. They force them to trade one of their own into slavery in return for one idol. And so the indigenous peoples are now coerced, which again is not emotional or psychological, at the end of the sword, to buy back the very idols they burned by trading their own members into slavery, all in the name of this God. Coerced by people, by the way, who are presenting the Christian God as complicit in their abuses. And Las Casas says the following. Once the local people saw that the undertaking by the missionaries that they would ensure the Spaniards would be excluded from the territory had not been honored, it was those self-same Spaniards who now brought back idols and made them buy after they had surrendered their own gods to the friars in burning in return for the promise of one single God they could worship. They were beside themselves, and as one man, they rose in revolt against the missionaries, asking them, "Why did you lie to us? Why did you trick us with your promise that you would keep the Spanish out of your territory? Why did you burn our gods when you knew that they would bring us others from other parts of the country which we would have to buy? Were not our own gods better than those of other people?" And what this is clear evidence that Las Casas and the indigenous peoples saw this as an abuse of power, an abuse of religious power. They understood the abuse as the sacred. I'm sorry? Oh, if I pass time, that's okay. Oh, yeah, I can totally do that. And so, because of this and other definitions of spiritual abuse, you essentially see that the Catholic Church and that Bartolome de las Casas both saw abuse as something more than emotional or psychological abuse. And so, if we're going to look at the definition that's being pushed all over the world, and I'm in a lot of Latino survivor communities, I'm in a lot of, because Latinos experience abuse in Protestantism too, especially in Miami, but all over Latin America now with the growth of it. What my argument here is that we have to shift the definition to actually include our experiences. And I don't think that anyone should accept this definition of abuse, not just based off of what I said today in history, but also our modern day experiences. And so, if it's all right, I can end there.
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
Professor, you're on mute. You can't hear.